the heating.
Oh, it isn't. Okay.
Today's the day for it to be cold upstairs. Oh man. I have to leave.
I need one upstairs for just a minute.
Okay.
But let me suggest you get started since
Okay.
I've seen the introduction.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, John, we're gonna go ahead and get started whenever
Okay.
you're ready to broadcast. Especially thank you to my friends and family and to the lab who has been so gracious in teaching me everything tech related so far that I know. And given that I didn't have that background, I'm very, very thankful. Thank you to my committee members and especially Dr. Hendler for their guidance and support in this project. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. And when I proposed the thesis in November of last year, I started with 3 levels. I wanted to look at this big level of what privacy is, right? So I knew that technology complicates the traditional notions of privacy. This is something that I've looked at for at least the first 3 years that I was with this lab. And then I wanted to move down into, okay, well, I knew that there were some system level failures on how to protect privacy. This could be from the technology used, from law. And so as I was unpeeling what I call the privacy problem, I finally got down to this micro problem, which is on the individual level, this idea of this privacy paradox that people have an attitude about privacy, but then do the complete opposite in their behavior, right? So I value privacy, but I'm willing to share my information because it's useful or because I want to connect with somebody. So when I was thinking of how to frame this problem, I knew that I really had to start in this red box, this individual section, right? Because this is where I could put together and bound a project essentially. And so I knew I would start here and then try to make my way up. So I'll go through that in my the rest of my slides. But I wanted to go ahead and come to the front with what the contributions are for this thesis. The first is what I spent a lot of time in the written document going over is what I call the privacy's framing problem. And this is inclusive of works from legal studies, from behavioral studies, and from the technology point of view, because I wanted to say, okay, well, what runs through all of these? And I'll go through that again in the next couple of slides. The second contribution is the empirical data that I collected and then analyzed. And lastly is this a design for a reflexive practice on how we use current methodologies to evaluate behavioral studies relating to privacy disclosures, right? So that was really important to me because even as I was putting together second contribution, I wanted to say, oh, I feel confident in the methodology that I used. And so I knew that there had to be some way to include that in the thesis as well. So to talk to the first contribution, which is privacy's framing problem, and I want to say that I was actually inspired by the Web Science methodology circle here, because what I've learning from my colleagues in web science is that you kind of have to look at it from a 50-foot, know what the different angles are, and then know where you can come in and solve the problem, right? And that in my case, it included all of these elements. It included the social, the legal studies, it included the behavioral, and it included technology. So this required me to do readings in all of these to understand really what privacy meant in this connected world. And to address my micro problem, I entered from the behavioral standpoint. And this is where I found a lot of literature on expectancy theory. So how do expectations shape your future behavior? And then the utility maximization. And this is where the trade-off notion comes into play. Information studies really pulls from this line of literature. And then I moved around the circle. When reading all of these, the terminology expectations went through pretty prominently through all three. It was a very strong framing. There's a level of expectations that is articulated in the Fourth Amendment. There's an articulation of it in notice and consent. There's obviously in behavioral expectancy theory, you're expected to behave the way, your expectation shapes the way that you behave in the future. So this is very much the main framing that I pull out that runs through all three. In technology, it's actually interesting. It pulls from social and behavioral, and then the analysis of it is that you're given the choice to change your privacy settings because you have the expectation, because that helps you mitigate your expectations for privacy risks, right? So because you're given this, Facebook setting, that helps you shape the type of expectation you might have on social networks. So in trying to kind of understand, okay, well, here's a framing problem that might be useful to help me understand what may or may not be working in the privacy discourse. I was trying to relabel privacy, and I was like, well, is it connected privacy? What kind of privacy is this? And so I was fortunate enough to come about to the work of Merrick and Boyd, who define network privacy in a very narrow sense in their work with teens and their information sharing practices on social networks. But I felt like, okay, this is a good starting point. This is where all of those elements that I was interested in, the psychology, the technology architecture, the social, and the legal, all merge in the middle. And they were able to give me some working definition. So in the remainder of the presentation, I kind of like to keep this in everyone's back of your mind is, okay, well, I kept network privacy as one way of thinking about privacy in this sense, where I could look at all three, at the intersection of all three. And while my study is different in that it, expands on a different population, it's not just teenagers, and it moves it out of social networks to mobile. It does share a lot of the elements on the left, which is privacy is context dependent. User relationships are help define privacy strategies, and I'll talk about how it's different in my study. And then privacy protecting strategies may be untraditional. So similar to Merrick's work, who found that teenagers used coded messages to talk to each other on social networks, I found different strategies that people use to obfuscate their information when sharing information with their mobile devices. I do want to kind of pin here what I found was problematic in the Merrick work and in the Boyd work, which is that there was still a very large emphasis on agency and control. And as I'll show in the evidence in the next couple of slides, this is where it gets a little hard position network privacy as the definition that I adopt, right? Because as the evidence will show, that agency actually doesn't play, and in my interpretation, doesn't play that much of a role. So again, going back to the kind of where I started, this is the initial research question, right? Where it starts on the individual level. So to what extent does the user's knowledge of and preference of how data is collected impact his or own expectation of privacy online? I would like to emphasize that in the next couple of slides, the study that I put together is qualitative in nature, but I did use instruments. I did a survey instrument, and I used semi-structured interviews in order to answer this question. Kind of a little bit of background. The survey itself was a convenience sample. I recruited on as many different types of social networks as I could. We did have an incentive, and I was able to gather 135 with a couple that I had to throw out because of no responses. And then I did follow up with interviews. So I'll go into those again in a second. And then in constructing the survey, which took quite a bit of time, I actually had a lot of elements involved here, right? I had to, since my question was wondering whether knowledge plays any role in the information sharing behavior, I had to figure out, okay, well, how do I measure knowledge? And in this case, I bracket my sample into what I call experts. And in section 1, I give 3 different ways on how I define expert. So there's how frequent someone uses it, how much knowledge they have about privacy and internet structures, and then how positively or negatively they feel about. I ended up being able to create a spectrum of expertise out of section 1. And then section 2 actually explores different levels of expectations. I'm particularly interested, again, in agency, this idea of control, and then violations of privacy. The questions originally had 2 case studies, which was location-based services and mobile payment systems. But as you'll see, it was a very, very large skew to only location-based services. So the majority of the written document and the slides that you'll see will focus only on that one scenario because of the way the response rate was. So the original hypothesis was consumers hold no expectation of privacy while online. And this was, I came to this based on readings, based on the literature, but also because of a conversation I had with my department in Cog Sci, where someone was like, I have no expectation of privacy. And so I really wanted to get at that, as I really wanted to understand what they meant by that. And so I used that as kind of my baseline. And then the second one is back to the whether or not expertise has any correlation or impact to your information sharing behavior. And informed by literature saying, you know, the more you know, the better choices you should make, right? And that's kind of the logic that goes through that hypothesis. So the first one is that actually you probably have some expectation of privacy, and at least based on my survey and my sample, it seemed like, okay, it may not be a high level of expectation, but there was a level of expectation. And then I'll go into how there were, after I extracted the experts and the novices, how actually there were more similarities between the two than there were differences. I do want to point out that, you know, based on the structure of the survey and the sample size and the skew of the sample size, I administered a non-parametric test to get some sort of significance testing and wasn't confident in the results I was getting. So on advisement from others, I actually ended up just going question by question, group by group, person by person to see what the splits were and how they varied across to make the analysis at the end. So that brings me to my second hypothesis, which is whether expertise had any correlation to the expectations. And interestingly enough, both groups mirrored each other. So what I found was that experts and non-experts had the same level of expectations regarding agency and violations. Okay, so I wanted to point out just a couple of interesting points. This question is actually not too surprising, I think, for anyone who follows this discourse. Comfortable sharing your location data with the following. Both groups strongly disagree that they disagree with advertisers, employers, and general public having that type of data. And then they agree that friends and family should be able to have that data. Now this mirrors things that Pew has put together, so I was pretty confident in that this was pointing in the right direction. And then a couple of differences. This one, again, doesn't raise a red flag, but was kind of interesting, which is a violation of your privacy. Friends and family sharing location on your behalf. Experts thought that was not very concerning, whereas non-experts found that pretty concerning, or most concerning. And then in another set of differences, unauthorized access by law enforcement. Experts found this most concerning, and non-experts not very concerning. So I offer a couple of potential reasons of why this might be, but again, I can't make a conclusive statement as to why, but I thought this was a really interesting difference. And then this one was another very interesting difference. Indicate your level of agreement with the following statement. I refrain from sharing my location data because of fear that someone may use the information to put me in personal danger. Experts disagreed with this and non-experts agreed with this, which I thought was really interesting, right? So after the survey data, I thought, okay, well, one, there's a lot of similarities between the two, but two, how do I know for sure that this is consistent, right? And so that raised more questions. The survey actually raised a lot more questions, which is what I tried to tease out when I started doing the interviews with my participants. So the semi-structured interviews were 13 total interviews. 6 were non-experts and 7 were self-identified experts. How they answered questions from the survey actually informed the questions that I asked them during the interview. It was about 320 total minutes of audio recording and coding, and I applied a thematic coding practice to this to find the patterns and key themes. So here are the themes that were that I ended up coding. The first 2, agency and data void, are based on literature. They're grounded in the literature that I had cited previously. And then the other 2, utility and resignation, actually emerged from the conversations that I had. So those were really interesting, and were so the pattern was so obvious that I had to make them into their own categories. I also want to note that the themes themselves are interdependent, right? So when I was highlighting and coding these things, it was very clear that agency and control had some relationship with utility, had some relationship with data void, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to go too far as to claim that they are independent or solely independent. So here are a couple of examples of what how I coded and what the themes were. The first one is utility, and I'd like to point out that because this was narrow in the sense that it only looked at the relationship of a user and their location-based tracking information, the notion of utility was very, very strong, right? People were like, I use this because it's convenient, because it's easy, et cetera, et cetera. So I noticed that the word convenience was used quite often in the responses. And this was very consistent between the 2 groups, between the experts and non-experts. For agency and control, this is where it gets really kind of, where the differences start to really come out, right? So for non-experts, prompted with the question, well, what do you do? A lot of them gave I changed my password when I first install. I turn off my location tracking per app, depending on the app. So that was actually pretty interesting. And then lastly, and probably the most notable, is they exercise self-restraint. Like that was a very strong tactic or strategy that people on the non-expert section articulated to me. Whereas in the expert side, the control mechanisms were use of Tor browser, use of dummy and garbage emails, use of false names, and opting out of things like cookies, right? So then we can start to see that the knowledge here is separated into really management. Like, how do they manage that future risk? The third one, again, this one is grounded in the literature related to knowledge of how data flows work, and this is inspired by Nissenbaum, really, is, okay, well, if people know how data is collected and what it's used for, does that make a difference? And a lot of in most of the interviews, and actually all the interviews, all of the subjects said, I have no idea what happens to my data, or how, once it's collected, I know it's taken somewhere. And so I called it the data void, because there was a recognition that the data was collected and that it would be used. And in this case, it's used for location purposes, for Google Maps and things. But beyond that, kind of a mystery to a lot of folks, which is interesting on both ends, both expert and non-expert. Okay, so last is my theme of resignation. And I actually have some audio clips that I'd like to play for these 2 themes, because as you notice, I characterize them based on this idea of sarcasm and skepticism. So you kind of have to hear the tone in which people use when they answer the questions that I prompt them. I'm sorry to the people in the front if this blasts you, but I need to get to the back. Okay.
All of that is just, it's a super fun show to keep everybody distracted. The fact that anything can be happening.
And then this is the non-expert.
That sense.
Okay.
And like the same thing with Google. Like, yes, Google is selling my data to whoever.
Right.
But at the same time, like sounds so user-friendly, so ubiquitous, and so essential, like to the point that, like, you know, our word now for searching for something on the internet is Googling it, right?
Right, absolutely. So again, I included this because I really want the determination of this resignation is not just based on the context, but really about how they said it, the way, the tone in which they gave me their comments. But this resignation was very strong on, again, in both groups, right? People felt that it doesn't matter, I need to share my information, or there's no other option. And those were the kind of phrases that bubbled up to the top pretty frequently for both groups. So based on the survey data and based on the interviews, I put together what I consider the two-mode consumer model. And the first, I'd like to kind of go through what the differences are before I get to what the similarities are. The first ones are survivalist. I call them the survivalist mode. And these are most part. But what's interesting is that these people, again, in terms of resignation, feel compelled to share their information because it's out of necessity. They are continuously plugged in. They have to share their information for work, for personal reasons, etc. They have little to no confidence in a third party's ability to keep their data secure, which actually also points to the last paragraph at the bottom, which says that these consumers would rather attempt to safeguard their information and fail than to solely rely on a third party for security and protection. So for them, the notion of agency is really an individualized sense of agency. Like, they are the only ones who can control the data as much as they can, right? Even though they know that it might go into this data void, I'm going to try as much as possible to obfuscate, use pseudonyms, et cetera, et cetera. The blind faith mode actually reflects the majority of the sample, which is the non-experts who use certain apps and share information because of the convenience and this lack of intrusiveness. That last audio clip, you could tell he said, you know, I don't mind using Google because they're essentially not intrusive, right? There's nothing offensive that they've done to me. This again echoes a lot of the same findings that Pew had, where there's a it depends frame, right? It depends on what the use is. So I kind of know that they're going to use it, but it depends if I trust the company, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to point out the very last point here is that the consumer mode, that this particular consumer mode relies on what I point to as the other, right? So they call them blind faith because they don't mind sharing the information because they have this notion that the other will protect them, and that could be in a court, in the law, in the courtroom, or through suing somebody or going through management. But it was never, I can control it. It's okay because there will be a remedy available to me in the future. So this is why I think it's really important that that the blind faith mode will likely be the mode that we need to consider when putting together recommendations for policy or for tech design, et cetera, because there is this reliance on that to be solved by somebody else. What's really interesting, though, is really where they intersect, right? And so where they really intersect is that they do understand that there's going to be some type of privacy violation in the future, right? And it can be identity theft. It can be, someone tracking me on Waze or things like that. But the probability of that violation to them is very low, even though the impact might be very high. So again, identity theft is actually a really big deal, but it may not happen, right? And then again, the expectation to little or no agency online. So these are the shared aspects between the two groups, which I thought was really interesting because these, especially the last one, again, points back to where network privacy might be kind of weak in the theory. So I'll kind of try to sum up what I just went through in 25 slides, is that, I started with trying to understand network privacy and expectation from the behavioral standpoint. And what came out of it is that, okay, a priori knowledge about privacy is actually not a really good indicator of whether or not someone shares information in the future. Because as the evidence shows, regardless of the knowledge and regardless of agency, they're going to share the information. Whether or not that's true information, whether or not that's accurate information, that depends on which mode you're in, if you're a survivalist or if you're a blind faith. And then again, that goes back to my last point, is that where there are differences is actually on the management of the privacy risk, so the after effect or the potential after effect, as opposed to I'm going to share my information, period, right? It's the, I understand that someone else can help me out, or it's I can take the tools to not share information, and then hopefully it will not be leaked or breached. So that moves me from the red box to what I call yellow box, which is, okay, how can this kind of study be really helpful in shaping public policy in the future? And so I came in the written document to a couple of alternative paths that might be interesting to think about. The first one is a systematic review of legal remedies that are possible or that are perceived by users and which are actually available. Because it was very clear from the conversations that people had this notion that, oh, I could just find a remedy for this, but may not actually be the case. So that would be, just how can we make sure that consumers understand what's available to them? The second one is work actually that was published by Balkan and Zitran about information fiduciaries, which places a legal obligation on entities like Google, because they are kind of like doctors in the sense that they now have to be accountable for your data. And then lastly is the development of a process or tool to give some sort of negotiation to folks if they want it, right? So maybe there's some way that, particularly like the new FCC ruling, where we can say, I don't want you to share my information, ISP, please don't, right? So this is one particular way to do it. The second is the study that speaks to my third contribution, which is to design a way to really understand whether or not my methods work. And this is work I've been doing ongoing with MIT, and it explores method techniques, right? And we're actually looking at 3 separate techniques, which is survey and decision trees, and posing the same question and following the decision points within each response. And so it is a between subject design. It took us almost 9 months to put together the experimental design, and we've executed to the sense that we have the first round of sample data that we're looking through, and we'd like to finish it out to make sure that we can publish something that says, okay, well, if you use survey data, this will likely be the type of answers you get. These are the limitations. If you use semi-structured interview data, this is what it will be better used to inform your work, right? So, and again, there is a lot of literature about survey design, semi-structured interviews, and I don't want to push that to the side, but I think for this, we just wanted to see, okay, if we're giving a very specific question, what changes and what minor tidbits can we get based on the type of method that we represent to the participant. Okay, so again, quickly review this. These are the thesis contributions. It's the understanding the framing problem of expectations, the real world evidence, and then finally that design of how can we make sure that we're using the right types of methods to understand these questions. So that brings me to my future work. I would love to take the survey that I put together and the experimental work that we're doing at MIT and really make that into a larger experimental project where we can control for a lot of the biases that I recognized in my own survey design in terms of self-selection and confirmation bias. The the MIT studies that we really spent some time cleaning those up. So I would really like to do the same with the survey that I first made, knowing that now, okay, location-based data is probably the scenario that I should just stick with, right? So these are learnings that I have from the study. The second is answering these two questions, and particularly the last one, and understanding what those long-term implications are for us as a society as we are more networked and where our lives are just networked. And I think I kind of touched lightly upon this in the written document about how folks blur that line, particularly when they're using their mobile phone, right? I'm looking for a Yelp review. That's both online and offline interaction. So how do we continue to, one, negotiate privacy in that sense, but two, like, is it useful to create regulations around that, or are there better technical designs? So those are as we continue to kind of merge these worlds where we may not need to make that distinction between online and offline, I'd really like to continue exploring that section. So where does this leave us, right? And I love this quote from a colleague over at the UK, because I think this is kind of how we feel. I think if anything, the contribution really is that we need to understand how consumers actually perceive the environment that they're in, right? And here, it's true that, you know, I would love to give consent, but the problem is, one, I'm resigned that I have to give the information, and two, that even if I gave consent, what does that really mean to me in sense of control, right? And so, not that it's a dire ending, but I would. This is where I would say, okay, the assessment of how consumers are, how consumers feel is the first step. So I have some evidence to that. So now we can move forward and do other things. And that would be the end. So I open it up to questions. And thank you. That would be John. Okay.
So just procedurally, what we do is have an open session for questions. Committee, you're welcome to ask questions to be answered in public, and then later, just four of us will have further questions.
Yes, Dominic.
In your interviews and in your survey work, did you notice people reacting or changing their behavior on the notion that they are being surveilled, they're being watched? There's this type of self-censorship, the type of thing, but they're still disclosing information, but what are they choosing to disclose? And does the fact of being watched, and you're kind of going, you look of surveillance changes behavior, changes.
Sure.
And change that context. Did you capture any of that? And what were your thoughts on that and between these different demographics you're looking at?
So actually that was most prevalent in the non-experts, which was an interesting viewpoint, because a lot of them said, oh, you know, and it could be because of the absence of understanding the tools that they may have at their disposal. They just say, well, I'd rather not. And so that's where that self-censorship was really strong. And they had a lot of people say, well, I just don't turn on the location data, or I don't share my location. Like I had a lot of people actually say, why would I share my location on Facebook? Like that was a very strong, I had a couple comments like that, but they all came from non-experts, which I thought was actually very interesting, because for experts, again, it was more the tooling is, oh, I can mask that, or I can find a workaround that, which was to me, okay, so the knowledge is not privacy in general, it's the tool sets, it's the opportunities that you could take to manage that privacy risk, which is different, right? Because the way that the literature was saying is, you know, as long as you have knowledge, you can have better information, better choices. You would make better choices if you have more information. So really what I'm trying to tease out is that you have to look, like there are differences between these groups of people. Lumping them in together is difficult when you're trying to come up with some sort of guidance for an entire group, right? When there really is some differences in how they manage the risk. Yep.
So you spoke a lot about the contrasting views of experts and non-experts. We're just wondering, what are some questions that they kind of agreed upon?
Yeah, so there were actually, out of the 51 questions, I would say 3/4 of that were same, or the same answers, or the average to the same medians. And so they agreed a lot on, like the first slide, advertisers. Don't care for advertisers, period, right? Where they, in terms of types of violations, they were very clear that things like sharing with office, like people, colleagues, and things were very much not okay with a lot of folks, for both groups. And then also they were very similar in the in their ways that they perceived whether or not a privacy would actually happen, right? So all of them were saying, well, I know that that there's going to be a violation that's going to happen. And I agree that will likely be the case. Like, that was a very strong shared sentiment. But I'm still going to share my information, even though I know that the violation will likely happen in the future. Maybe it will be a big deal because I have my identity stolen, but for the most part, the potential for a privacy violation didn't deter anybody from sharing. Yes.
So you've been enough of my defenses, and I occasionally like to throw in that.
Uh-oh.
An interesting one. This one's yours. Well, what I'd really like to know is, were there any surprises? Was there anything you found that, a lot of your stuff validated stuff that's in literature.
Yeah.
What did you find that you think would be really surprising?
So I think the biggest one was actually the amount of similarities between the two groups, and that the only real pronounced difference was in the way they had different management tools, right? And it came down to the tooling. It really just came down to what tools were available to me, what process do I understand, but the fact that they all shared is going. I know it's collected, but I don't know where it's going. And then the level of resignation throughout the group was actually very strong. Which I understand then why people say I have no expectation of privacy, even though they might use tactics that preserve privacy, which is important. But I think this idea that I have no choice but to share my data is a really interesting one. That is. Everyone kind of has that feeling, but it was really powerful to hear people say it on tape.
Yep. Did you look at like sort of different sorts of privacy violations? Like, did you differentiate between them? Because one of the things I'm thinking of is if you have survey respondents who identify as non-heterosexual,
right,
or as non-gender conforming,
yeah,
depending on what state they live in.
Yeah.
Disclosure of certain information could mean that they lose their jobs and such like that. So even something as innocuous as like location data, like looking at a gay bar on a Friday.
Right.
Versus like, that would be a huge difference depending on what state that person lives in, what their employer is like. And that's, whereas, I guess I was just thinking mostly of would you consider it bad if a friend or family disclosed your location on your behalf?
Right.
So you've got the spectrum of like, oh, I was tagged at this party and my parents thought I was, I told my parents I was studying, versus
I
was tagged at this gay bar and my employer will fire me if they find out,
right?
Versus like identity theft,
right?
Did you analyze like those sorts of differences and distinctions?
Sure. So for the survey, it was a little bit harder to get down into that, because one of the things that I learned in putting together the survey is that in order for practices is actually to reuse questions that are used in other survey tools, just so that it's consistent, and then you can measure against previous. So those types of questions, what do you find to be privacy violations, were pretty standard and pretty, I would say, on the high level. So I wasn't able to drill down. Now, when I was having conversations with people, that's when things, and so I had a lot of, I had like one or two people say, I hate it when my husband or partner checks me in on Facebook, right? Because of X, Y reason, right? Like I either don't want to share, or like I'm more private. but those little tidbits didn't really come out until I started having interviews. Now, if I were to redo the study and say I just want to focus on those types of interactions, I'd survey questions so that they could fit that. But for this purpose, I had to keep it kind of high level for the survey question.
Kristine?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. This is kind of in the reluctant acceptance resignation kind of department.
Okay.
And it also, it may require a little speculation on your part that you might not want to get into.
Okay.
There are those who have equated this universe of private data as something like a natural resource,
Right.
as fueling the future economy. And further, they have thought about it not unlike natural resources like minerals or oil, those sorts of things. And in thinking about that, we also think about how the government has, over quite a period of time, over more than the last century, has kind of tilted towards those interests who are capitalizing on those resources in terms of policy. And which is, in the mineral space, the natural resources space continues to this day. And I'm wondering, the speculation part is this the root of the feeling of resignation that we currently feel? And is this where we're going in terms of this policy making in the future?
It's a great question. Yeah, you're gonna ask me to speculate. You're forcing me to make some.
Well, you can deal with that. Did you see anything? In terms of even the experts responding and some of the resignation they felt in that space, and then.
Yeah, so I'm kind of flipping through the actual interviews in my head right now, and I could say maybe out of the interviews that I had with experts, I actually didn't have very many people relate it back to specifically government surveillance, whereas I had quite a few just cite industry, in the sense that it was always Google. Like, that was what people were mentioning in their interviews, was like, understand that there's a treasure trove of my information on Google. Like, that was pretty consistent through both groups. Now, whether or not people thought of themselves as a resource, a natural resource, like their data is being a natural resource, I only had one I can remember that said, I'm just a data point, and I'm giving it away for free, like that kind of phrasing out of the interviews that I had. That's not to say that there might be some folks who have that same sentiment, but essentially in the interviews that I conducted, that didn't seem to come through.
Okay.
Could I just ask another slightly out of the box question?
Of course.
It's based on, I think, what underpins some of your interview questions. So I really like the expert non-expert distinction as referring to privacy. It does suggest though that everyone's talking about the same thing when they're talking about privacy. This is a little bit to your point. So I wonder whether you. I'm not trying to get you to undermine your whole study, but I wonder whether you came away feeling confident that actually all these people from different perspectives are pointing to something in common.
Right. So I want to say yes, I do feel confident, because the study itself gave them a very narrow example. They all picked location-based services. But when I spoke to them, they gave me a very expansive set of examples that said, I don't just apply this behavior to location-based tracking. Like, I understand this is applied to social networking. I understand this is applied to my my relationship with my financial app. So given that, I thought, okay, well, this notion of resignation isn't just because of the location-based tracking scenario I gave you. It's because they understand the ecosystem and their position within that ecosystem. So that's how I position my. Oh, maybe.
So my question is more about when you were segregating your participants based on expert and novice. So you actually, I guess, set up questions on the frequency.
Yeah.
Are you able to get a clear-cut, segregation that yes, these are experts and these are novices and these?
Yeah. Actually, it ended up being that the section 1B, which is the quiz, which is that privacy quiz, became the determinant of who became an expert, because the questions were, were related to, what is the mosaic effect? What, who is the regulatory body that, protects privacy? So there is a span of questions, and those people who scored the highest in that tended to also have high frequency, high affect. So that was easy to determine that they were what I would call experts on the far end. Now, what was interesting is the entire sample, everyone had high affect, high frequency to a sense. Like a lot of people it skewed heavily to that side. So it really came down to how much they knew about the space of the privacy space.
How much percentage of people?
This is why it was difficult to do the testing, was that there was only 10 out of the 135 that I could just extract that were what I called experts, because they were when you looked at the spectrum, they were from the middle up. They were essentially 6 and up on my grading scale, which is how I determined that they were the experts. So it was a very small subset of the full sample. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is where it would be really it would be great if I could up-level it to a more contained experimental, because I let it loose and I just had to wait to see if I had experts. Whereas if I could go out and say I need people from this field, then I could control the size a little bit better, which would be great. Yeah.
I'd like to come back to, when I was listening and you got the resignation, I said, okay, this is my first exposure to policy. I translated, and if you agree with the translation, response translates to, I think, or I translate it as, informed consent is not an option. Mm. And from your presentation, I take two ways of getting there. One is,
right,
and your experts were pretty serious experts.
Yeah.
Really, we're not in a position to do informed consent.
Yep.
In the sense that we usually deal with it.
Right.
And the other is, and this is, all of us experience no really bad consequences.
Yes. Yeah.
Nothing bad happens.
Right.
So, since we don't experience bad consequences, we're not going to try that hard.
Right. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
We're not going to do the effort to become informed.
Right.
I don't know what my experience is. The worst consequence I see is every once in a while I get reminded of how much data mining is going on when I see, how did that ad get there?
Right. Right.
You go shopping for a friend and all of a sudden you're seeing something that you wouldn't.
Right.
And you realize, so it's informed consent. To go.
Right.
When you say that a policy person might say, well, one of the things we can conclude is the whole concept of informed consent.
Yeah. May not
doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it seems like that has implications at the level of who does what policy.
Yes. And I do address that in my written document about whether or not informed consent or notice and consent should be the mechanism that we're using in the future, and in not just from a legal standpoint, but also from a technical design standpoint, because privacy settings are essentially of it. And so I tried to tread lightly on that, because I'm not a lawyer, but I wanted to make that statement. I don't think that that is sufficient as in terms of protection.
Yeah, to follow up on, is it principle?
Mm-hmm.
When you were talking about your issue, I was thinking reasonable people could think about, I don't want someone to know where I've been in terms of the text. But I don't think very many people can understand what can be done with big data analysis of graphic materials.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to tag the picture.
Oh, right. Right. To
Right,
know where
so-
you were. Yeah.
Now, I don't know that anyone could. Informed consent may.
And actually, one interesting
yeah.
comment that came out maybe twice from the conversations was, I see data breaches all the time. I saw, I know the OMB did it. I know Home Depot, and this is more from the experts. So again, this builds into the resignation. The breach is going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm just going to I'll deal with the breach when it happens, but it's inevitable that it will happen. And I think the coverage, and there's people talking about this now, the coverage of data breaches is actually undermining privacy protections because it's desensitizing people to it to a level, right? And it's like, oh, there's another breach. Okay. Like
Terry and I now keep a list of all the sites where we record our credit card so that when we get the new one, we can go update them. Get a new credit card like every 4 months now.
Right, and actually that's also really the examples in where identity theft and credit were cited because they were replaced and remedied so quickly. People that was like, oh, well then I don't worry about it so much because I know my bank will just refund me the information or the money that's stolen when my identity is taken. So
just one anecdote.
Yes.
Appreciate talking what you were asking. So we were interviewed by a local TV station.
Oh, yeah.
They're still preparing it. They said it'll be a week from tomorrow.
Oh gosh.
But the thing they have focused on as the one that they really see as the most interesting thing that people don't know and is getting people upset.
Yeah.
Right. The fact
Yeah.
that you and I can go to Staples, buy the same
Wow,
thing,
yeah.
you'll see
Yeah.
it at a different price than I will.
Right.
And when they make people aware of that, suddenly people
Sure.
have this visceral reaction that that's wrong.
Right.
That online.
Not only that, but we can actually see that there will be immediate and real consequences.
Yeah.